Okay, think about this for a second. Over 70% of our planet, it's ocean. And that holds something like 97% of all water we have. It's just mind-bogglingly vast.
It really is. And, increasingly we're realizing this huge resource might actually hold some maybe surprising keys to tackling big global issues.
Like climate change, our energy needs.
Exactly, those two huge ones. And what's really exciting now are these innovative ideas that try to link them, using the ocean not just for, say, clean hydrogen fuel, but also to actively pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it.
Yes, and that is exactly what we're getting into today. We're exploring this really fascinating new method. It's detailed in an article in Advanced Sustainable Systems.
Right. The title is Electrodeposition of Carbon-Trapping Minerals in Seawater for Variable Electrochemical Potentials and Carbon Dioxide Injections. Quite a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. But the work itself is super interesting. It's from researchers mainly at Northwestern University and CEMEX Innovation Holding. Devi, Gong, Shoji, Amy Wagner, a whole team.
Alexandra Guerini, Devi Zampini, Jeffrey Lopez, and Alessandro Rotta Loria are also on that list. And our mission here, for you listening, is really to unpack how this electrochemical thing works.
Yeah, we want you to understand why these mineral byproducts they create are actually a big deal, not just, leftovers.
And what possibilities this opens up for, well, a more sustainable future. We'll try and do it without drowning you in technical terms.
Okay, so let's break it down. The basic idea, they call it electrochemical seawater splitting.
Right.
Think of it like using electricity to split water, specifically seawater, into its parts. So you get hydrogen clean fuel potential at one end, the cathode.
A negative terminal?
Yep. And at the other end, the anode, you get oxygen or maybe even chlorine gas. That part's kind of established, right?
That's the baseline, yeah. But here's the twist, the really interesting part. This research focuses on what else is happening at that cathode simultaneously.
Okay.
Besides the hydrogen, minerals are forming. They're precipitating out of the seawater. Things like calcium carbonate.
Like chalk, limestone.
Exactly that stuff.
Yeah.
And also magnesium hydroxide. And crucially, this process gets a big boost when they deliberately pump CO2 into the water near that cathode.
Right. And it sounds like maybe in the past, if people were just focused on making hydrogen, these mineral deposits, they were seen as a problem, like limescale in your kettle.
Precisely. Like buildup, fouling, something that hinders the main process, reduces efficiency. So, yeah, the goal was often to stop it from happening.
But this research completely flips that script. It says, hang on, these aren't just unwanted gunk.
No, not at all.
They're actually a valuable resource.
That's the key insight. They're taking what looked like a bug and turning it into a feature, a really valuable one. These precipitates, the calcium carbonate and magnesium hydroxide, they have a ton of potential uses.
Like what?
Well, think about construction. Huge industry, right? These could be raw materials for concrete, cement, plaster, even things like paints or fillers. The scale is potentially massive.
Wow. So instead of scrubbing it off, you could be harvesting building materials.
That's the idea. And it's not just construction. They could be useful in manufacturing, too, or even environmental work.
Environmental? How so?
Think about fighting coastal erosion, maybe replenishing beaches. Or, and this is cool, the paper mentions that similar electrochemical methods have actually been used before to help restore coral reefs.
No way. That's a fascinating connection. Okay, let's talk more about the CO2 injection. That sounds critical for the carbon capture part.
It absolutely is. By feeding CO2 near the cathode while the electricity is running, they basically supercharge the formation of that calcium carbonate.
How does that work chemically?
Well, the CO2 dissolves, forms bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. This actually makes the water right there a tiny bit more acidic, lowers the pH locally.
Okay, a little bit more acidic. But I thought mineral formation needed things to be more alkaline. How does that work?
Good question. It's about the interaction. So the hydrogen ions from the CO2 react with existing carbonate ions, making more bicarbonate. But key, the electrolysis itself is generating hydroxide ions at the cathode. Lots of them.
Right, the OH ions, making it alkaline right at the surface.
Exactly. And those hydroxide ions react with the bicarbonate, some of which came from the injected CO2, and this whole chemical dance shifts the balance, causing calcium carbonate to precipitate out. It essentially locks the CO2 into a solid mineral.
So the electrolysis makes the spot alkaline enough for minerals, and the CO2 provides the carbon to be locked up. Clever.
Very. But, as you hinted, they stress that the CO2 injection needs careful control.
Right. It's not just more is better.
Definitely not. Too much CO2, and you can actually make the seawater less conductive right where you need the reactions to happen.
Ah, increased electrical resistance.
Yep, which means you need more energy to run the whole thing, potentially wiping out some of the benefits. Finding that sweet spot for CO2 flow is crucial.
Makes sense. Let's zoom in on those reactions a bit more. You mentioned pH going up at the cathode, down at the anode. How does that cathode pH rise drive the mineral formation?
Okay, so you apply the voltage. At the cathode, you've got electrons flowing in. Two main things can happen. Oxygen dissolves in the water, can grab electrons. That's the oxygen reduction reaction, ORR. Or water molecules themselves can split the water reduction reaction, WRR.
And both of those make.
Hydroxide ions, OH. That's the key byproduct. More hydroxide means higher pH, more alkaline, right around that cathode surface.
And that's the trigger for the minerals.
That's the trigger. Seawater is full of dissolved calcium ions, magnesium ions, and bicarbonate, carbonate ions. In that alkaline zone created by the hydroxide, these ions find each other, react, and precipitate out as solids, magnesium hydroxide, and calcium carbonate mostly. The paper lays out the exact equations showing how the ions combine.
Okay. And meanwhile, at the anode, the other terminal.
That's where oxidation happens. Electrons are being pulled away. Mostly, water gets oxidized to form oxygen gas.
Okay.
But they also mention if you crank up the voltage, you might start oxidizing chloride ions, which are abundant in seawater, to produce chlorine gas.
Chlorine. Like for pools.
Sort of, yeah. And interestingly, they suggest even this could be captured and used maybe for disinfection or other chemical processes. So they're really thinking about utilizing all the outputs.
It really sounds like a whole system approach. Okay, back to that balance. You mentioned the CO2 making things slightly acidic locally, the electrolysis making things alkaline locally. How do they manage that interplay?
It's pretty neat. The ideal setup generates just enough hydroxide at the cathode to neutralize the acidity from the dissolved CO2, react with a carbon source to make calcium carbonate, and precipitate magnesium hydroxide, all without drastically changing the overall pH of the bulk seawater flowing through.
Like a localized chemical factory on the electrode surface.
Exactly. And if you generate a lot of hydroxide right there, it can push the water's natural carbonate chemistry even further towards carbonate ions, which really favors making more calcium carbonate.
So they can tune this. Can they control how much mineral they get and maybe even what kind of mineral?
It seems so. The research shows, generally, more electrical energy in sea means more minerals out. Makes sense. But the CO2 flow rate is also key.
The sweet spot again.
Right. For a given voltage, there's an optimal CO2 flow that gives you the most mineral for the least energy penalty.
Yeah.
Too little CO2, you're limited. Too much, you get that resistance problem or mess up the pH balance.
And I think the paper mentioned something about how the minerals stick to the cathode differently depending on the reaction.
Yes, that was interesting. Under conditions where the oxygen reduction reaction, ORR, dominates, the minerals tend to stick better, form layers on the cathode.
Okay.
But when the water reduction reaction, WRR, takes over, especially at higher voltages, you get hydrogen gas bubbles forming.
Ah, bubbles.
Yeah, and those bubbles can actually knock the newly formed mineral bits off the surface, making it harder for them to grow into big attached structures right there.
Okay, so they figured out how to make these minerals. What did they find when they actually analyzed them? What are they made of?
They use some pretty standard but powerful lab techniques, like X-ray diffraction, thermogravimetric analysis.
The fancy ways of seeing what crystals are there and how they behave when heated.
Basically, yes. And they confirm the main players are calcium carbonate, mostly calcite and aragonite, different crystal forms, and magnesium hydroxide, which has the mineral name brucite.
Calcite, aragonite, brucite. Got it.
And interestingly, they found they can influence the ratio. By tweaking the voltage and the CO2 flow, they can shift the balance. Generally, higher voltage and that optimal CO2 rate favor getting more calcium carbonate.
Which is good because that's the one trapping the carbon, right?
Exactly. That's the direct CO2 sequestration part. And their tests definitively showed the carbon was locked into that calcium carbonate structure.
They proved it worked.
They did. They also used scanning electron microscopy, super zoomed in pictures to see the actual shapes. They saw different crystal habits like little cubes, needles, fibrous structures, depending on how they ran the experiment.
Okay, this is cool. But individual crystals are one thing. How do you get to something useful, like for construction? They mentioned growing larger aggregates.
Yeah, this is where it gets really practical. By adjusting the settings, the electricity, the flow, and letting the process run for longer, like days, even up to 30 days in some experiments.
Wow, 30 days.
They managed to grow these minerals directly onto the cathode into centimeter-sized chunks, aggregates.
Like little rocks growing on demand.
Kind of. And they noticed something useful. As the aggregate grows, the effective current density seems to drop, which actually helps the aggregate stick better and continue growing stably. They even found the shape of the electrode you start with can influence the final shape of the aggregate.
So you could maybe grow specific shapes. That's wild. What about the inside of these aggregates?
Yeah,
Solid.
not entirely. They found they're naturally porous. And the amount of pore space depends on those reaction conditions again.
Ah, let me guess, the hydrogen bubbles.
You got it. More WRR means more hydrogen bubbles means more porous aggregates. Less porous if ORR dominates.
But is porosity bad for strength?
You'd think so, but here it's actually helpful during growth. The pores allow the seawater ions to keep diffusing into the aggregate, feeding the reaction and letting it grow from within, sustaining the process over time.
Ah, okay, so it's like a built-in plumbing system for growth. What about the final composition of these bigger chunks? Still just calcium carbonate, magnesium hydroxide?
Mostly, yes. It might not be perfectly uniform throughout, and they even found traces of another calcium carbonate form called vaterite, which is usually less stable.
Okay. But you mentioned something earlier about even more carbon storage potential within the magnesium part.
Yes, this is a really exciting kicker. The magnesium hydroxide, brucite, within those aggregates can react further with CO2 after it's formed. It can carbonate.
So a second chance to capture CO2.
Exactly. It forms magnesium carbonates. And the study saw this happen quite effectively, like an 80% conversion rate in their tests. This could significantly boost the total amount of CO2 stored, potentially up to half a ton of CO2 for every ton of aggregate.
That's huge. Almost like a CO2 sponge that gets activated later.
It is. And there's another benefit to this secondary carbonation. It actually makes the aggregates stronger.
How so?
As the magnesium hydroxide converts to magnesium carbonate, it seems to fill in some pores and change the internal structure. They measured the compressive strength, how much squeezing it can take, and saw it jump significantly, from around 1.4 megapascals up to over 6 megapascals after carbonation.
Stronger and stores more carbon. That's a fantastic combination.
It really is. Plus, they found the particle sizes they were getting were generally in the right range to be used as aggregate in concrete mixes.
So it meets industry standards, potentially?
What's promising, yes.
Yeah.
Fits within the typical specs.
Okay, let's pull this all together then. What we're seeing is this really elegant system using electricity on seawater, adding CO2 carefully
Right.
to make clean hydrogen fuel, and at the same time create these mineral aggregates that lock up carbon and can be used as actual materials.
That's the core idea. Turning a byproduct, even a nuisance, into a valuable product. Or actually, two valuable products, hydrogen and carbon-negative materials.
With potential uses in construction, manufacturing, maybe even environmental restoration?
Exactly. It's that dual benefit that's so compelling. Tackling energy and materials and carbon capture potentially all in one process. And they suggest it could be scaled up using modular reactors.
Now, they do mention limitations, right? It's not perfect yet.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
They acknowledge things like needing to improve the overall energy efficiency, the Faradaic efficiency, and needing more tests on material properties like long-term durability, hardness, resistance to abrasion, that kind of thing. Standard next steps for material science.
But overall, the takeaway is that this approach, seawater electrolysis, boosted by CO2 injection, it looks really promising.
Highly promising, I'd say, for both capturing carbon and making useful stuff sustainably from the ocean.
So as you've been listening, just think about that. Taking a climate problem, CO2, and this incredibly abundant resource, seawater, and using some clever electrochemistry to turn them into literal building blocks for a greener future.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other things that we currently consider waste or just there might hold similar hidden value if we just look at them differently,
Yeah.
apply some ingenuity.
A fascinating thought to end on.